many Australians, Anzac Day is one of the most important national occasions. It's observed on the 25th of April each year and marks the anniversary of the landing of Australian and New Zealand troops, known as Anzacs, on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey during the First World War. The significance of Anzac Day lies in the remembrance of the sacrifices made by Australian and New Zealand servicemen and women in all wars, conflicts, and peacekeeping operations since the Gallipoli landing. It is a day for Australians to honour and pay tribute to the bravery and selflessness of those who served, and especially those who gave their lives for their country. Anzac Day is commemorated in many ways, including dawn services, marches, and wreath laying ceremonies at war memorials and cemeteries. The dawn service held at sunrise is the most solemn and significant commemorative event, as it reflects the time of the landing at Gallipoli. It includes the playing of the last post, a minute of silence, and the recitation of the Ode of Remembrance. Anzac Day is not just a day of mourning or grief, but also a day of national pride and identity. It represents the spirit of the Anzacs, courage, mateship, and sacrifice, which has become an important part of the Australian national character. It also reminds Australians of the value of freedom and democracy and the ongoing responsibility to defend these values. In the post-Federation era of Australian history, there are very few families that haven't been affected or touched by the hand of war. My family on both sides had a lot of young men sign up to serve both at home and on foreign shores. For example, in episode 1, I spoke of Clarence Wignall and his heroic exploits on the Western Front that saw him receive the military medal twice. As I record this episode, Anzac Day is less than 24 hours away, and I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about those who never made it home to Australia after giving their all. Thomas Worley Little is my maternal grandfather's uncle. He was born in Euroa, Victoria, the son of David and Mary. His brothers Les and Robert also signed up along with a number of his cousins, all eager to do their bit. Tom was well educated and spent much of his teenage years in Melbourne, eventually working as an assistant engineer just before the outbreak of war. Like many other young men, he signed up while still a teenager, no doubt inspired by the exploits of our diggers at Gallipoli. Back then, the media were reporting a more adventurous tale than the actual horror that was taking place. So it's not really that surprising to see youngsters answer the call, thinking they were in for a rollicking good time. On his medical examination, he's listed at 5'7" 3/4". That's 175 centimeters in today's language, and 10 stone 3 or 65 kilograms. So not overly big, even for the time, but not small either. He was declared fit for active service on 16th of February 1915 and arrived on the Gallipoli Peninsula with the 23rd Infantry Battalion at the end of June, quickly receiving a promotion to Lance Corporal. He was still only 18 years old by that stage. By November, he was given a temporary promotion to Corporal due to his fine leadership qualities. After the Gallipoli withdrawal in December, he spent some time in Egypt for training and preparing to be sent to the Western Front. And at some point prior to embarkation, he requested a demotion back to private, which was granted regretfully. No doubt he'd felt that it was a suitable punishment for the 2 days he'd spent absent without leave in late January of 1916, and felt that maybe a big sign of his own leadership was to take the hit and cop it on the chin and move on. In March, the 23rd arrived in France and proceeded to the Somme district, taking part in the Battle of Pozières. The Battle of Pozières began with the capture of the village by the 1st Australian Division of the Reserve Army, the only British success in the Allied fiasco of the 22nd, 23rd of July, when a general attack combined with the French further south degenerated into a series of separate attacks due to communication failures, supply failures, and poor weather. German bombardments and counterattacks began on the 23rd of July and continued until 7th of August. The fighting ended with the Reserve Army taking the plateau north and east of the village, overlooking the fortified village of Tipval. from the rear. Tom was involved in this action reasonably early, entering the battle on the 28th of July. German counterattacks and bombardments were fierce, and while attacking, Tom was hit by a shell and lost his life. Due to the chaos of frontline battles, he was lost in no man's land and reported as missing in action. However, several witness statements later attested to seeing him hit and killed. One such account from Private Dallaston of the 23rd Battalion is as follows. I was told by Private Freyer, also of the 23rd, that he had seen Tom Little blown to bits by shellfire. He was of over average build, medium complexion, and we called him Kid. In a further statement, Private H.A. Daly said, I met Little's brother at Rolling Stone Camp in Salisbury Plains on December 16th. He told me he knew Little was dead. Corporal J. Mooney reported, in the case of Little, he was in my section, and that's all I can tell you, other than that on the date mentioned, 28th of July 1916, we all fell in on that evening for the purpose of moving into line for the charge. My battalion did that night, and the last I saw of him was I fell my section in, and he was present and marched off with the rest about 8 o'clock for the front line. That was the last I saw of him, although I believe he went over the top with us and was absent for call the next morning. Although a thorough research was made, no trace was found of him. Another witness statement by Private D. Pearce in April 1917 described Tom as 20 years of age, around 5'9" or 10, fairly stout at 12 stone. He was also growing a mustache at the time. He'd certainly grown a lot since joining up a year and a half earlier. It took near enough to a year before Tom was officially declared killed in action, and his family were informed. He was 19 years old and had been in country for a year at the time of his death. John Leonard Orr, a cousin of Tom Little, joined the 5th Infantry Battalion on 17th of August 1914, very soon after the war was declared. He was employed as a warehouseman at the time and was 23. John was the son of John and Isabella, who resided in Windsor, a somewhat well-to-do suburb of Melbourne at the time, and even more so in the modern era. At 180 centimetres and 70 kilos with dark hair and dark complexion, he definitely would have stood out. He embarked firstly for Egypt for training on the 21st of October on board the Orvieto, further travelling to Gallipoli within the first 2 weeks of the campaign beginning. Sadly, he wasn't on the front line long, as the brutal fighting at Cape Helles took its toll on both the Australian and Turkish sides. John received wounds to his groin area on the 14th of May and was immediately evacuated to a hospital in Alexandria, where he passed away a day later. He was buried at Chatby War Memorial Cemetery in Alexandria, and after a request from his family at home, his personal effects were returned to them. Frederick Roy McGregor, known to all as simply Roy, is an interesting story, as he initially enlisted under the false name of Lachlan Colin McGregor. He was under 21 at the time, however, he could legally enlist with parental permission, which I'm assuming he didn't have. It is stated on his attestation form that his correct name is Frederick Roy McGregor. Roy is a paternal relation, being connected through a common ancestor, Charles Somerell, our first arrival in Australia, and a pioneer of the Monaro district in New South Wales. The McGregors settled in Melbourne's northern suburbs and lived in a nice-sized house at 43 Elder Street, Essendon, known as Lachlan, no doubt after Roy's father. Serving with the 7th Battalion, he journeyed to Egypt on board the Hurrata, leaving Melbourne on 19th of October 1914. Interestingly, the same troop ship and battalion as his cousin Clarence Wignall from episode 1. Clarence was in C Company and Roy in D Company, so they would have been somewhat close to each other, but not entirely. I would say they would have had some sort of contact, though. Roy made it through the Gallipoli campaign and was quite the letter writer, as seen in one written on the 2nd of June 1915 and published by the Essendon Gazette on September the 2nd. We've been away from Mina 6 weeks now. We were at Lemnos Island for 2 weeks, and then we went to meet the Turks at Gallipoli. And I assure you, they gave us a warm welcome. In fact, it was that warm that it burnt. My reception was a bullet in the back. Needless to say, I swore like an Australian. We were barely 100 yards from the shore when the Turks opened fire, and by jingo, they did pepper us. The water around our little boat was literally boiling. But luckily for us, their shooting was terribly bad. But as it was, we lost 18 out of 25 men in our boat alone. So you can imagine what it was like. But the boys took it without a murmur, though everyone was hit in some place or other. Well, we at least touched the beach and jumped out of the boats and got under cover, then opened fire. Altogether, there was only 150 of us landed at this particular spot. I assure you it hurt to see my mates shot down before my eyes. But I've got used to seeing dead men now. I take no notice of them. By the time this letter reaches you, I'll be back in the firing line doing my bit with the boys. After we started advancing, we had a lot of trouble with snipers. They were picking our best men off all day long, and I'm hanged if we could sight them. They were that well concealed. At last, an Indian got one. He was walking along and he sighted a puff of smoke coming from under a bush. He rushed over, pulled the bush away, made a swipe with his big knife and got him. Oh, they are great fighters, are they, the Indians? They're as cool as cucumbers. Take absolutely no notice of the shrapnel, etc. They will do the Australians to fight alongside. More letters were published in the Essendon Gazette on October 14th and read, Corporal Roy McGregor writes to his mother from Anzac, Gallipoli. He explains that Anzac is made up of the initials of Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. On 5th of August, he left Browns Hill for Lone Pine, a new position that had just been taken, unfortunately at a great cost. He described the stench arising from the dead bodies as very unpleasant. They even had to walk over corpses at times. The enemy are handy with bombs, and the Australians are also adept at this mode of warfare. In some places, the enemy's trenches are only 70 yards away, only a barricade of sandbags separating the combatants. On the 11th of August 1915, he continues, things are quiet now, but during the past few days, the Turks have had some hurry up. Our chaps attacked and took 3 lines of trenches. We're having very decent weather. The days are not so hot either. It was great to hear all the guns firing the other night. A beautiful sight watching the shells bursting on the hill. The Turks must have had a terrible time. This is Saturday afternoon, but I won't be playing football with Keeler today. Continuing, he says, after a spell in which we were doing no tiling, our guns opened with a heavy bombardment, and an infantry brigade attacked and captured 3 rows of Turkish trenches and held them. A large number of men were lost, but the Turks must have lost 5 times as many, as the captured trenches were full of dead bodies. Our fellows captured 8 machine guns and 1 million rounds of ammunition. The Turks counterattacked, throwing a number of bombs, but our fellows stuck to their costly gained trenches. I must tell you of the bombardment which started on Saturday, continuing at intervals till Wednesday. It was great to hear the big shells going over us. Besides all our land guns, there were monitors and warships firing. I felt glad I was not in the Turks' place. They must have had terrible losses. Their return fire was very poor. Our artillery observers knew where most of their guns were too, and our artillery blew most of them out of existence. He also says that the strain is telling on some of the lads who had been, at the time of writing, over 16 weeks in the trenches and were in much need of a rest. When they come out of the trenches, there are fatigue duties to do. Often we put our periscopes above the trenches, the Turks fire at them, and we wave a miss when they fail to hit them. The trenches are so close that they are often hit. We have got the Turks very jumpy lately. They often open up a heavy fire throughout the night, throw up flares, but we never fire a shot, and they don't know what we are doing. We all wish they would attack, for we would give them a terrible time. In another letter dated 22nd of August 1915, he writes, "Things are very quiet and the weather is getting cooler. We had another bombardment and then an attack on the left. 3 or 4 lines of trenches were taken and held. I went round to see the trenches which our troops had taken, and the stench was dreadful. The trenches were full of dead, and everyone had to walk over them. These were all buried. The Sunday night, the 7th went into the trenches. The Turks tried to get them back, but our fellows hung on like glue. The Turks attacked heavily with bombs, and our boys replied until their supply of bombs ran out, when they had to depend on their rifles. In 3 hours, our battalion had 380 casualties, mostly wounded, but they hung on. And when the Turks attacked with the bayonet, our boys repulsed them the 3 times. The 7th were given great praise for the way they stuck to the trenches. General was in the trenches when the Turks attacked, and he called out to the boys to stick out to the last man, and they did stick. Our colonel, Pompey Elliott from episode 1, is a great soldier. He said at Mooney Pond Station when we were lined up to go to St Kilda Barracks on the morning of our march out to camp that he would never ask a man to go where he would not go himself. He has been true to his word, and the battalion would go anywhere with him. The reinforcements take to him straight away." After surviving the Gallipoli campaign, Roy was promoted very quickly, ultimately to sergeant, during training for the Western Front campaign. He went on to fight in several actions during the Third Battle of Ypres, losing his life on 7th September in the vicinity of the Menin Road. 3rd Ypres had a very large involvement by Australian forces and saw many casualties on both our side and the Germans. It did, however, pave the way towards the Allies breaking through a massive deadlock. A touching notice was published in the Argus on October 14th, 1916, and it read, "McGregor, killed in action in France on the 7th September, Sergeant L.C. Roy, youngest beloved son of Mr. and Mrs. L. McGregor, Elder Parade, Essendon. Duty nobly done. One of the Anzac heroes." His remains were buried at Bedford House Cemetery at Zilbeek, Belgium. He was 21. James Patrick O'Brien is another relative with Charles Somerell as a common ancestor. Born in Temora, New South Wales in 1882, he was 33 years old when enlisting with the AIF in 1915. He was originally assigned to the 11th Reinforcement of the 2nd Battalion and was quite lanky at 180 centimetres and 152 pounds. On arrival in France, he was transferred to the 53rd Battalion, taking part in sanitary duties, which I believe was collecting the dead and burying their remains. It didn't take long for him to be given another task, being detached from his battalion for mining duties. One of the big activities during the Third Battle of Ypres was the underground mining beneath enemy positions where thousands of pounds of explosives were placed. This is really well depicted in the movie Beneath Hill 60, which I highly recommend to watch. During the Second Battle of Bullecourt, James was wounded in action while back in the 53rd Battalion. This battle was fierce and saw huge casualties on our side due to numerous German counterattacks. More and more Allied troops were poured into the conflict, and when the Germans eventually withdrew, more than 7,000 Australian troops were either killed or wounded. The site had no strategic importance in the overall scheme of things, and it just seems senseless to send so many young men into the meat grinder for nothing. Claude Clarence Guttison is my paternal great-granduncle. He was the first son of James and Mary Jane of Fitzroy in Victoria. Born in 1887, Claude was already a man who'd experienced life by the time war arrived at his age of 27. In 1909, he married Maud Ford, with daughter Elma and son James following within the next 2 years. James would later go on to serve in the Second World War and be captured by the Japanese, which I will talk about in a future episode, as well as his son, also named James, who was a pretty well-skilled VFL footballer in the 1960s. Maud passed away in 1912, leaving Claude to raise two infant children, which is why I've always wondered why he chose to join the army and fight overseas. I do plan to look in a little bit more into Claude's story when I cover his son and grandson as well. So I will get to that when that happens. So he did enlist in the 22nd Infantry Battalion in July 1915, and his attestation papers show him as 5'3" or 161 centimeters tall and 9 stone 6, 61 kilos, which is, look, he was pretty small for those days, really small by today's standards. That's actually him in the thumbnail posing for a photo wearing the old safari hat. I am surprised he was accepted in, going on his size. He had sallow complexion and black hair. His occupation was baker, something that a lot of subsequent family members tried their hands at. He was also able to write his own name and signature as a sign that he'd received a decent education. Claude's experience with the army wasn't a happy one, as he reported sick several times during training in Egypt and spent some time in hospital on 3 occasions. His brothers, Arnold, my great-grandfather, and Ralph, both found themselves in trouble with authorities during their periods of enlistment. So I can only imagine how their widowed mother must have been feeling at that stage. Eventually recovering, Claude and the rest of his battalion headed to France in preparation for a big push at the Battle of Pozières. He arrived at the front on 10th of August 1916, right at the end of the main battle. Fighting did still continue for some time, with some of the bombardments from both the Allied and opposition sides being among the largest of the entire war. Just on 2 weeks after joining his battalion on the front line, Claude died of wounds received in combat. He was initially taken to the 44th Casualty Clearing Station, but his wounds were fatal. He is buried in the Pushvia War Cemetery in the Somme district. Paternal second cousin Edmund Percy Wignall served his country during the Second World War. Born in Murchison near Shepparton in 1920, he was 20 years old when he fronted at the Katunga recruitment office to join up in the cavalry. That could be Katunga. Don't quote me on either of those pronunciations. Unlike previous wars where the cavalry fought on horseback, the more modern style of war saw them using armoured vehicles such as tanks and tank destroyers and armoured troop carriers and the like. Edmund remained in the 7th Cavalry Division, which was rare as most Victorian and South Australian troopers were redeployed to the formation of the 8th Division at some point. Not a lot of detail is available online, but what I did find out that Edmund was in the 2nd 7th Regiment, which was a commando unit, which is kind of dashing and cool. In September 1942, the regiment was sent to New Guinea to help defend Port Moresby as the Japanese continued their advance along the Kokoda track. Upon the 2nd 7th's arrival, the decision was made for the regiment to leave its Bren carriers in Port Moresby, and as the campaign began to turn in the favour of the Australians, the 2nd 7th were flown to Popondetta to reinforce the units there in December. For over a month, they took part in the fighting around Huggins Roadblock along the Sananada track, serving in the dismounted role as infantry. It was during this series of actions that Edmund's life was lost in battle at the age of 22, just as the Australian forces were beginning to get the upper hand. He was buried in Port Moresby and was also commemorated in his hometown of Murchison and at Katunga.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.